I only meant to complain about the leaky pipes, but my landlady had one rule: every complaint must end with wine. I never imagined that one glass would change everything between us. I had only lived in the house for 2 weeks when I found myself walking through the back garden late one evening, still half annoyed about the pipes upstairs that moaned like an old violin every time I ran the shower. The air was cooling after a warm day, that soft kind of dusk where the sky looks bruised with pinks and violets. I wasn't expecting to see anyone outside. But there she was, my landlady, sitting at the small iron table near the hedge, a bottle of wine already opened beside her. She looked comfortable in a way I never quite managed to. Shoulders relaxed, hair pulled loosely back, her posture elegant but unforced. The glow of the porch light caught the side of her face, softening her features in a way that made her seem younger and older at the same time, youthful in her smile, wise in her eyes. "Evening," I said, awkward, half wondering if I was intruding. She gestured toward the empty chair across from her. "Evening. You look like you've got something on your mind. Sit down, unless you're afraid I'll charge extra rent for the seat." I laughed, easing into the chair. "Actually, I was going to complain about the plumbing. Pipes upstairs sound like they're haunted." She tilted her head, lips curving into something between amusement and mischief. "I don't mind complaints," she said, reaching for the corked bottle, "as long as they end with wine." The glass slid across the table toward me, the reflection of her hand lingering in its curve. I hesitated for only a breath before taking it, the cool stem pressing into my palm. And just like that, the tone of the evening shifted. We clinked glasses, a soft sound that seemed far too intimate for two people who were supposed to be nothing more than landlady and tenant. The first sip warmed my throat, but it was her gaze, steady, playful, assessing, that made me feel the heat rise in my chest. She asked where I was from, what I studied, what I was doing in this neighborhood of all places. I answered in fits and starts, my words tumbling with the clumsiness of someone aware he was being listened to closely. She didn't just nod along, she leaned forward slightly, elbow resting on the table, chin in her hand, as though nothing in the world was more interesting than what I had to say. When I turned the conversation back to her, she shrugged with a casual grace. "This old house keeps me busy. Tenants, repairs, and on evenings like this, a bottle of red to make it all easier." Her voice carried something underneath the humor, an undercurrent of solitude maybe. A kind of quiet resilience that drew me in. The night insects had started their chorus, and the air smelled faintly of earth and roses. She poured me a second glass without asking, the wine flowing in a dark ribbon, and her fingers brushed mine lightly when she handed it across. It was the briefest touch, yet it lingered in my awareness as though she had left some invisible mark. We talked longer than I expected, about trivial things at first, the neighborhood, the quirks of old houses. But beneath it, I felt a rhythm building. A kind of gentle ease that didn't belong to strangers. When I finally rose to leave, she gave me that same mischievous smile. "Remember," she said, lifting her glass, "complaints are welcome, but only if you bring your appetite for wine." I went upstairs that night with the taste of red still on my tongue, and the quiet, unnerving certainty that this woman, my landlady, was going to matter to me in ways I wasn't prepared for. I hadn't expected the second glass of wine to last as long as it did. By the time the bottle was half empty, the sky had deepened into that rich, velvety blue that only appears for a brief moment before night claims everything. The garden lights flickered softly, their glow catching on the rim of her glass every time she lifted it. We were still seated across from one another, but the distance felt smaller now, as if the conversation itself had pulled us closer. She asked me about my work, though work might have been too generous a word. I told her about my half-formed plans, about how I was juggling part-time shifts while trying to figure out what I really wanted to do. My words felt clumsy, almost apologetic, but she didn't laugh. She just listened, her eyes steady, her chin resting in her hand as if each sentence deserved her full attention. "You're young," she said after a pause, her voice calm and certain. "You don't have to know yet. People act like life is a race, but sometimes it's just wandering until you realize where you were meant to stop." The way she said it made me wonder how many times she had had to remind herself of the same thing. When I asked about her life, her smile flickered, still warm, but edged with something unspoken. She told me about her travels in her 20s, how she once lived out of a suitcase for months, chasing sunlight across cities and coastlines. She laughed when she admitted she'd gotten lost in Venice and ended up eating gelato 3 times in one afternoon because she couldn't find her way back to the hotel. Her stories painted her in a different light, spirited, adventurous, bold. It was almost hard to imagine that same woman now tending to a creaky old house and tenants like me. Then, in a quieter moment, her tone shifted. She spoke of how silence had become a little too heavy since her divorce. How the house sometimes felt bigger than it needed to be. She didn't say it with bitterness, only with a kind of quiet honesty, as if stating a fact that had simply become part of her life. I felt something tug inside me. Not pity. Something closer to recognition. I knew what it was like to feel a little unmoored, to look around and wonder if the version of your life you were living matched the one you'd once imagined. The wine loosened both of us. Our laughter came easier, tumbling over shared jokes about the neighborhood cat that acted like it owned the place, or the way the old pipes groaned as though they were auditioning for an orchestra. Each laugh felt like another thread tying us closer together. At one point, she leaned across the table to refill my glass, and in that simple gesture I caught a detail I hadn't noticed before, the faint perfume clinging to her wrist, a scent that was floral but grounded, elegant without being overwhelming. Her fingers brushed the rim of my glass, and when I looked up, our eyes caught for a beat too long. The air seemed to still. Just for a second, I thought I saw the same quiet awareness flicker in her gaze, the same unspoken thought I was wrestling with. Then she smiled, soft and knowing, and the moment drifted away like smoke. By then the garden had grown hushed. The world felt reduced to 2 people, 1 bottle of wine, and a conversation that seemed reluctant to end. The soft hum of night insects filled the silence between words, and I realized I wasn't in a hurry to leave. When she finally leaned back, stretching slightly, she sighed with contentment. "It's funny," she said, "how easy it is to talk to someone you barely know. Easier sometimes than with the people you've known forever." I nodded because she was right. And because I couldn't shake the thought that, in some inexplicable way, I wanted to keep being that person for her, the one she could talk to, long after the bottle was empty. The first drops of rain arrived like an interruption, soft, tentative taps on the garden table. I looked up at the sky, surprised by how quickly the evening had shifted. A few moments earlier, the air had been warm and still, the stars just beginning to show. Now, clouds had gathered without warning, heavy with summer rain. She glanced upward too, then met my eyes with a playful grimace. "Well," she said, pushing her chair back, "I suppose that's our cue." We moved quickly, gathering the glasses and the nearly empty bottle as the drizzle thickened. By the time we stepped inside, the sky had opened properly, rain tumbling against the windows in steady streams. The house felt instantly cozier, the sudden storm making its walls seem like a kind of refuge. "Here," she said, reaching for the old blanket draped across the back of the sofa. "You'll catch cold if you sit around in damp clothes. Besides, you might as well stay a little longer." There was no hesitation in her voice, just quiet certainty, as though my staying was the most natural thing in the world. She spread the blanket across the sofa, its fabric soft and faintly scented with her perfume, then sat down with the relaxed grace of someone at home in her space. She patted the cushion beside her, and I followed, settling in close enough to share the warmth. The sound of the rain filled the silence at first, drumming against the roof, hissing through the gutters. It was oddly soothing, like a rhythm meant to slow everything down. She leaned back, glass in hand, and I noticed the way her hair, looser now, a strand falling forward across her cheek, softened her whole expression. Our conversation picked up again, but it was different inside. Softer, quieter. The kind of talk that doesn't need to fill every second, because the silences are comfortable too. She told me how storms had always been her favorite, how as a girl she used to sit by the window just to listen. I admitted I found them calming, too, like the world was giving permission to pause. The sofa wasn't large, and the blanket pulled us even closer together. At one point, our knees touched, lightly at first, but neither of us shifted away. The warmth of that small contact spread through me, a subtle current I couldn't ignore. Her glass tilted slightly as she swirled the wine, and for a moment she didn't speak. She just looked at me, as though weighing something unspoken. Her eyes lingered longer than before, and I felt the pull of it, the quiet, magnetic awareness that hung between us. I tried to focus on anything else: the rain, the hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen, the faint scent of lavender from the blanket, but every detail seemed to circle back to her. To the way her shoulder brushed against mine when she shifted. To the way her voice dipped lower, softer, when she asked me about my family, my childhood, the pieces of myself I didn't often share. As I answered, I realized my voice had changed too. Slower, more open. Not the clipped, careful words I gave most people, but something closer to honesty. Something vulnerable. The storm carried on outside, the windows streaked with rain. Inside, the world had narrowed to the space of that sofa, the closeness of her presence, the rhythm of our breathing. At one point I caught myself staring at her hands, the elegant way she held the glass, the faint movement of her thumb along the stem. And then, when she set it down, her hand rested lightly on the sofa cushion between us, close enough that if I shifted just slightly, my fingers would brush hers. I didn't. Not yet. But the possibility was there, suspended in the air, undeniable. It struck me then that something had shifted. We were no longer simply landlady and tenant, no longer two people passing time with small talk. We had stepped, quietly, almost without noticing, into something more. Something fragile and uncertain, but real. When the rain softened into a steady patter, I thought about leaving, about retreating upstairs to let the night end before it grew heavier with meaning. But I didn't move. Neither of us did. And in that stillness, I understood, the line of familiarity had been crossed, and nothing would feel quite the same again. By the time the storm outside had softened into a distant drizzle, the weight of the evening had settled on me like the heaviness of the blanket we'd shared. I lingered a moment too long on the sofa, knowing I should stand, that if I didn't, the air between us would grow even thicker, more dangerous. So I forced myself to rise. She didn't stop me. She only watched with that quiet, unreadable smile, the kind that held both welcome and restraint. I muttered something about needing to get up early, about not wanting to overstay. She nodded, graceful in her silence, though the look in her eyes carried more than her words did. As I made my way to the stairs, the old floorboards creaked beneath my weight. My hand lingered on the banister, unwilling to let go just yet, unwilling to disappear into the solitude of my room. I could feel her presence behind me, even without turning, the soft clink of glass as she gathered the empty cups, the faint sigh she didn't mean for me to hear. Upstairs, in the dim light of my room, I sat on the edge of the bed, restless. The rain tapped faintly against the window, echoing the rhythm of my thoughts. She was older. My landlady. The one who handed me keys and collected rent checks, who fixed the quirks of the house with a practiced hand. What right did I have to blur those boundaries? And yet, how could I deny the way her laugh had settled into me, the way her eyes seemed to hold mine a moment longer than they should? I lay back, staring at the ceiling, and felt the conflict play out inside me. Part of me wanted to protect the simplicity of our roles, to keep the lines sharp and safe. But another part, the larger part, was already imagining what it might be like if those lines were gone. Downstairs, she sat alone at the table, the bottle of wine nearly empty. She ran her finger absently along the rim of her glass, the faint hum of it barely audible above the fading rain. Her shoulders had lost the relaxed posture of earlier, replaced by something heavier, more contemplative. She thought of her life since the divorce, how most evenings ended in silence, how the house often felt too large, too empty. She had told herself she didn't mind, that solitude was easier than the vulnerability of beginning again. But tonight something had shifted. A young man with honest eyes and uncertain plans had sat across from her, listened without judgment, laughed in a way that made the house feel alive again. It unsettled her, that pull. It was flattering, yes, but it was also dangerous. People would talk, maybe. Tenants moved in and out, but she had to stay here. Could she risk complicating the safe rhythm she had finally found? She traced the rim of the glass again, then set it down firmly, as if the sound of it on the wood might silence her thoughts. But when she closed her eyes, she saw him, his hesitant smile, his restless energy, his awkward but sincere honesty. Upstairs, I turned in bed, restless under the weight of questions I couldn't answer. What would people think? What would she think if I overstepped? Was this simply wine and conversation, or was it the beginning of something neither of us had expected? The house groaned with its usual night sounds, the shifting beams, the sigh of the wind through old windows. Yet tonight those sounds carried something different, as though the house itself had noticed what had passed between us, and was holding its breath in anticipation. I pulled the blanket higher, but the warmth did little to quiet the chill of uncertainty. I told myself to forget it, to treat it as nothing more than a pleasant evening. But deep down I already knew, nothing about tonight could be forgotten. The memory of her smile, the press of her knee against mine, the way she had let silence speak louder than words, those things would stay with me, reshaping every glance, every word between us from now on. And somewhere downstairs, I imagined her doing the same, sitting in the dim light, glass in hand, wondering if she had let herself cross further than she meant to, and if, perhaps, she wanted to cross even further still. A week passed before anything else happened. A week of quiet mornings, hurried routines, and me trying, unsuccessfully, to convince myself that what I felt that night had been nothing more than wine and rain and imagination. I avoided lingering in the kitchen, avoided the sound of her footsteps on the stairs, even avoided her shadow moving through the garden in the evenings. It was safer that way, or so I told myself. And then, one Thursday evening, I found it. A bottle of red sat neatly outside my door, 2 clean glasses beside it. Tucked between them was a folded note. The handwriting was elegant, a little playful. For future complaints. I stood there longer than I should have, the paper warm from my hand, my chest tightening with both hesitation and anticipation. I could have left it. I could have pretended I never saw it. But some part of me already knew that wasn't possible. So I carried the wine downstairs. She was waiting in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with that same calm poise I had come to recognize. She didn't act as though she had been waiting, but the second our eyes met, her smile betrayed her. "Well?" she asked, raising her brows. "Any new complaints?" I set the bottle on the table, trying to sound casual. "Only that it feels unfair to drink alone." Her laugh was soft, almost shy this time, and something about that subtle shift disarmed me completely. She brought 2 plates, small things, bread and cheese, as though she had expected me all along. We poured, we clinked glasses, and just like before, conversation found its own rhythm. But tonight felt different. Lighter somehow, and heavier all at once. She asked me about my dreams, what I wanted beyond the half-formed plans I had mentioned before. I stumbled at first, embarrassed by how uncertain I was. But she didn't tease. She encouraged, pressing gently, as though she wanted to know the version of me I barely admitted to myself. And when she spoke of her own dreams, the ones she'd once had and the ones she still held on to, it surprised me. She confessed she had wanted to open a small cafe once, years ago, something quiet and warm where she could know people by name. Life had carried her elsewhere, but I could hear the wistfulness in her voice, like the dream hadn't completely let her go. The wine loosened us both again, but not in the same way as before. There was less of the cautious distance, more of a deliberate leaning in. Her laugh, when it came, was softer now, almost vulnerable. And when I passed her the glass to refill, my hand brushed hers, light, unintentional, but this time she didn't move away. Our eyes met. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was charged, the kind of silence where every heartbeat seems louder, where every shift of breath carries meaning. I looked away first, forcing the moment back into safer territory. But I felt it, the invisible thread between us, pulled taut, waiting. We talked until the night pressed close around the windows. At one point, she reached for the bottle, only to find it empty, and her soft sigh carried more than just disappointment at the missing wine. The storm of the week before had drawn us together by accident. But tonight was no accident. Tonight was a choice. She had left that bottle at my door knowing exactly what it meant. And I had carried it downstairs knowing exactly what I wanted. When I finally rose to leave, the pause lingered. Her hand rested on the table, mine close enough to cover it. I didn't. Not yet. But as I turned to go, she spoke quietly, her voice steady, her eyes fixed on mine. "Next time," she said, "don't wait for a complaint." And I carried that sentence with me upstairs, heavy as the bottle in my hand, knowing there would be a next time, and that neither of us was pretending otherwise anymore. The following evening felt different from the start. I hadn't planned to see her. I told myself I would stay in my room, catch up on work, maybe even read something to keep my mind from circling the same thoughts over and over. But when faint music drifted up through the floorboards, old jazz, warm and crackling through her stereo, it was as if the house itself was calling me back down. I found her in the living room, a small lamp casting a golden pool of light over the sofa. The rain had gone, leaving the air clear and still. She sat with her legs tucked slightly under her, glass in hand, eyes half closed as though listening to more than the music. When she noticed me, she smiled. Not the practiced, playful smile she used when joking, but something softer. Something that felt welcoming. "You're just in time," she said, gesturing toward the half-full bottle on the table. "I was beginning to think I'd have to drink this one alone." I sat beside her, closer this time. Not across the table, not with the cushion of distance, but shoulder to shoulder, sharing the same blanket draped lightly over her lap. The music filled the pauses, a trumpet bending its notes in a way that made the silence feel alive. We talked less than before. The conversation slipped into gentler currents, small reflections and quiet admissions. I told her about a childhood memory, how I used to sit on the roof with my father to watch storms roll in, the two of us wrapped in silence that didn't need words. She listened with the kind of attention that made even small memories feel important. At one point, she leaned forward to pour more wine, and a strand of hair fell across her cheek. She brushed it back quickly, but not before I noticed how it softened her face, how it made her look almost vulnerable in that moment. Without thinking, I reached out. My fingers grazed her temple as I tucked the strand gently behind her ear. The touch was brief, but the world seemed to hold its breath. She didn't pull away. In fact, she leaned slightly closer, her eyes lifting to mine with a question she didn't ask out loud. For a moment, neither of us moved. I could feel her breath, steady, yet tinged with something unspoken. My hand hovered a second longer than it should have, then dropped back to my lap, though the warmth of her skin lingered against my fingertips. The music carried on, low and steady. She rested her glass on the table and, in a gesture that felt both natural and monumental, placed her hand lightly on my arm. Not gripping, not pulling, just resting, as though to say, "I'm here, I feel it too." It was astonishing how much could be said in silence. Her touch was gentle, but it anchored me. It was an admission neither of us dared put into words. We didn't kiss. We didn't need to. The closeness, the deliberate lack of retreat, was enough to speak volumes. I felt it in the way she exhaled softly, her shoulders loosening as though she had let herself finally stop holding back. I felt it in the way my own chest tightened, not with fear, but with certainty. The house around us was quiet, the kind of quiet that belongs to late hours and unspoken truths. The lamplight painted her in warm tones, and for the first time, I stopped thinking of her as my landlady at all. She was simply a woman I wanted near me, and I was a man who could no longer pretend otherwise. We stayed like that for a long time. Music, silence, her hand on my arm, my pulse beating far too loudly in my chest. And when I finally stood to leave, the hesitation was mutual. She didn't want to break the moment any more than I did. But she let her hand linger on mine as I rose, and the weight of that simple touch followed me upstairs like a promise. It wasn't spoken aloud. Not yet. But we both knew. Something had been admitted, quietly, irrevocably. The night after our quiet admission, I carried the weight of it with me like a secret pressed against my chest. I worked through the day, tried to distract myself with routine, but every ordinary moment seemed sharpened by what had passed between us. Her hand on my arm, the closeness, the silence that had said more than words. By evening, I found myself downstairs again. Not by plan, not by invitation this time, simply because I couldn't stay away. She was in the kitchen when I arrived, sleeves rolled to her elbows, rinsing glasses at the sink. The overhead light gave her hair a golden sheen, and for a moment I simply stood there, watching, trying to decide if I had crossed into something foolish or something inevitable. She glanced back at me, and her lips curved into that small, knowing smile. Not surprised. Not questioning. Just glad I had come. Another complaint? She asked lightly, though her voice carried more warmth than tease. I held up the bottle I'd brought with me, a modest red from the corner shop. No complaint this time, I said. Just thought I'd return the favor. Her eyes softened. She dried her hands, accepted the bottle, and set it on the table. There was no ceremony in the way we sat, no tentative space left between us. It was natural now, the rhythm of pouring, clinking, sharing. For a while we spoke of ordinary things, the weather clearing, the garden she wanted to replant, the way the neighborhood seemed to come alive after rain. But beneath it all was a pulse, steady and undeniable. Every laugh lingered too long, every pause stretched into silence that neither of us hurried to fill. When the conversation dipped, she leaned back in her chair, studying me. Her expression was thoughtful, almost vulnerable. I wasn't expecting this, she admitted quietly. Any of it. I thought, at my age, life would be settled, predictable. But then you showed up, carrying too many books and looking like you hadn't slept in a week, and suddenly the house didn't feel so quiet anymore. Her honesty stunned me, not because I hadn't sensed it, but because hearing it aloud made it real. I swallowed, my throat dry despite the wine. I wasn't expecting it either, I said. You're my landlady. You're older. I kept telling myself I shouldn't feel this way. But I do. The words hung there, fragile but unshakable. She didn't laugh. She didn't dismiss it. Instead, she reached across the table, her fingers brushing mine before settling there, steady and deliberate. The warmth of her hand seemed to quiet every restless thought in me. I don't know what this is, or what it could be, she said softly. But I know I haven't felt this alive in a long time. We sat in that truth together, the clink of rain dripping from the gutters outside, the faint hum of the old refrigerator filling the silence. Then she lifted her glass. A small gesture, but one that carried weight. To unexpected company, she said, her voice steady, her eyes locked on mine. I raised mine to meet hers. The gentle clink of glass felt like more than a toast, it felt like a quiet promise. When we set them down, I didn't retreat. Not this time. I reached across, covering her hand fully with mine. She turned her palm upward, letting our fingers lace together, and in that simple act, every hesitation melted. We didn't declare anything grand. There were no rushed confessions, no dramatic claims of forever. But there was clarity. We weren't landlady and tenant in that moment. We were simply two people who had found each other in the unlikeliest of places, choosing to sit together in the glow of lamplight, with wine between us and a future unwritten. Later, when I finally rose to go upstairs, she stood too, walking me to the base of the staircase. She touched my arm lightly, almost as though to confirm that I was real, that this was real. Good night, she said, her voice soft but certain. Good night, I replied, lingering a heartbeat longer before climbing the steps. And as I reached the landing, I realized that whatever came next, we had already crossed the most important line, not the one between landlady and tenant, not the one between age and expectation, but the one between solitude and connection. We had chosen each other. Quietly, tenderly, undeniably. 12L.